Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. These are your two sharp needles, Gavin Rice and Jack Stanley. And in this episode, I am actually going to be learning a lot today, which I'm really excited about. Jack is going to talk about Edison's failed machine models and types, etc. So, Jack, I'd like you to take the reins and drive the stagecoach.
Okay. Yeehaw. Let's get going here. Okay. Well, a couple of things. First off, I wanted to make a correction before I start. On our last program, I was talking about Jesse Lippincott and Edison working together, creating all their various companies that dealt in dictating machines. That was not the National Phonograph Company. It was the North American, which I meant to say. So I wanted to correct that little boo-boo there because I figure someone will hear it and say,
How dare you?
I know. It's foul-feeded, fuming, foggy, and filthy. Okay. So to get on with the whole thing, there was a big problem with the Edison machines in their earliest point because they used batteries. And first off, we have to understand what a battery was. In 1880, 1890, this was not your D cell or your C cell. This was a jug in which you mixed your chemicals. Hopefully you didn't spill it. And then you would run the wires to your machine and have your chemical electricity work the phonographs until that wore out, and then you had to do it all over again. And so they were thinking of different ways to power machines. And they were thinking of the various things that might work. And I wanted to mention two that I thought that are my favorites that just didn't quite make it. Number one was the finger-powered phonograph. Now, what this had was a little lever, and you'd use your finger and go up, 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 to make it turn. And so you'd sit there and do this, and after probably about, a minute or two, your fingers starting to get kind of tired here, and I would imagine it would start getting a little difficult. So it didn't go much of anywhere. But my personal favorite is the water-powered phonograph. This interesting piece could play a record, could give you a little bit of time with 1 gallon of water. Now, of course, they didn't say where the water would go after it went into the machine. You'd have to run it off into some way to exhaust the water. And I can just imagine the various experiments that went on with that. Of course, once again, it dealt with not having to deal with batteries and basically solved the issue, but also created more problems in many respects. And so, of course, eventually they went back to batteries, and eventually in 1893 or so, they finally developed a spring motor. I think it was called the Triton motor, that was able to power the spring-motored phonograph. And eventually the spring would, push the battery away because, once again, it was just too cumbersome, too difficult. And the spring was a lot more economical, although not cheap. None of these things were cheap. We look at things today with a sense of understanding money as we look at it. We see a machine that was $25. We say, oh, it was only $25. That was an absolute fortune. You have to understand that $25 was more than a month's salary for most workers. And if you think about it, a phonograph that cost $25, that was incredible. You could buy a house for $300. So this was a tremendous amount of money. And so they were not the kind of things that would be purchased all the time. And it was very much, in a sense, like the descendants of the phonograph, let's say radio and television, the same thing. One family would get one, and everybody in the block would come and listen to it. just like it would be with the radio, same thing with the television. But that was the very, very beginnings. And in that mix, of course, you had some of the more bizarre and the more unusual ideas on all companies. That's the start there.
You know, just thinking about the finger-powered phonograph, I just can't help but think of our finger-powered phonographs right here, you know, with Spotify and YouTube. I think that's just silly, but I can also, can you describe a little bit the mechanics? I know you explained how the finger pushes a little lever. So is the lever connected to a wheel that spins the,
I
you know,
believe so.
I see. Okay.
Because the only existing bit of the finger powered machine was an illustration. There, as far as we know, none existed. I do believe that there is a water powered one. And of course, the water one was basically working sort of like a water mill. Basically it would basically push the wheel around and keep a somewhat steady speed with the gallon of water. Hey,
Now that's interesting.
Too.
You know, it makes me think of how, you know, there was a lot of water power going, of course, steam locomotives, you know, you had steam engines, but I was actually talking to a friend about this the other day about steam powered cars and how I'm sure they were the future. And, you know, if Edison improved on his water powered phonograph, that would have been interesting. But I was thinking maybe what if someone experimented with a steam? Oh, well, there are that Swiss-made steam engine-powered phonographs, right?
Yeah, there's the ones that actually use like
like a Stirling engine or something.
Yeah, and it creates a flame that basically turns the turntable. I always remember a friend of mine who passed away right around the time you were born, Dave Heitz. He had a phenomenal collection. He was an amazing collector. He had one of those machines that basically it used like butane, and you would light it, and the flame would burn within the case, and your turntable would go around with the heat of the flame. And the day he decided to show me it, the whole thing just went up. So I can imagine that's one of the reasons they weren't very successful. They probably had a lot of boo-boos, and basically it went out in the trash, probably with the water-powered phonograph.
That's really, and did you know anybody who had an example of like a diagram or like a blueprint of this of some sort? Or
I've seen pictures of the water-powered.
That's cool. That's very cool.
But I've only seen illustrations, like from Harper's Weekly or something like that, of the finger-powered one.
And now Edison's recording lathes were weight powered, if I'm correct, right?
I believe so, yes.
And that was we were talking a little bit about that in the last episode, the weight powered British phonograph.
Well, that was with the tinfoil.
That was the tinfoil, right? Which is just interesting, you know, how far back weight powered goes, you know, for anything. So,
well, yeah, it's a brilliant way of doing it if you think about it.
And now something interesting is that there was a period from, I think it was 1890 to 1895 where Edison, Columbia, the American Phonograph Company and Columbia, they were both powering their machines with batteries.
Yeah.
Which is, I think that's also really cool when electricity was just, and this is kind of a fun fact. I work at Bernenzio Uptown Music, which is a dealer of antique instruments, and we specialize in banjos, guitars, etc. There is a banjo that we have called an AC Fairbanks Electric. And I was thinking to myself, like, oh, could it be an electric banjo? But those are from the 1890s. And it was funny. This is just kind of a little sidetrack. The reason why they called it that is because it electrified the sound, because that's when a lot of things were being powered by electricity back then. Phonographs, you know, lights, the incandescent light bulb was electrically powered, and it's just really interesting to think about. And
it's a magical word in those days.
Yes.
Sort of like the electric belts that were selling in those days. That was good
That's
for
right.
your health and whatever and stuff like that. And they were selling them at World's Fair.
That's
And
right.
like, you know, the other thing that's kind of interesting, you know, um, I think I had mentioned this in a previous show, but since we were talking about the tinfoil, um, Bell and Tainter really wanted to give it to Edison. You know, they were a little annoyed with him. And so they decided that with Edison, he did a nursery rhyme. And they, of course, being somewhat more highbrow, did Shakespeare. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio. You know, and of course, the first recording was actually on a tinfoil machine in which they put wax within the grooves and did their recording. But of course, then of course they changed it, did the ozocerite. But they were always pushing. They were always pushing to find a way to do one-upmanship on Edison. And I have to say, the Columbia machines were really very beautiful if you think about it. I mean, they were nowhere near as tough or as hardy as the Edisons, but they were damn pretty, and they certainly looked nice. And the other fact is, of course, Columbia had the best lawyers. Perhaps one of
Absolutely.
the best was Philip Morrow, and he'll change the entire phonograph industry. He's an amazing individual. I don't know if you're too familiar with him, but he is incredible because he is the person that single-handedly changes the entire disc industry. We can talk.
He helped, you know, if I'm not mistaken, he helped kind of push forward the double disc record idea, right?
No, 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 no. We're going way, way before that.
Okay, way before that. That's right. The development of the disc, rather.
The
You know.
development of the disc, and basically, to put it in the Reader's Digest version, Berliner came up with the disc record, and Columbia wanted to make disc records in the worst way. Now, in between here became a fellow by the name of Frank Seaman, and Frank Seaman was the marketing director for Berliner. And he wasn't getting enough money as far as he was concerned. He made a contract in what? I think it was in 1896 for 12 years or so, something like that, that went to like, 1914 or whatever. No, 1896 to 19, well, something like that. I forget. I don't know the exact number of years. But nonetheless, he started marketing Berliner machines and records, and he did a phenomenal job. And being phenomenal, he went to Berliner and said, hey, I started with this company was nothing, and I have made it into something really great. I think I should get a better cut on these machines. Berliner was more or less saying a deal is a deal. Excuse me. And at this point, Siemens starts saying, okay, you want to play that game? I can play that game too. And he develops the Zonophone record. And he even goes further. He copies the Berliner records and pirates. And all this while, Philip Morrow, who is the lawyer for the Columbia Company, is trying to kill Berliner, but Siemens fighting them off. And at this point, Siemens says, screw it. He said, you're right. You have a point here, because what they were arguing about was a needle moved by a groove. It was a patent for a feed screw to move across the cylinder machine so the floating stylus could go across the cylinder. It had nothing to do with a phonograph needle. But Philip Morrow was a really sharp cookie. And he got a Berliner gramophone. He put the needle on the record, and the groove moved the needle. And he said, damn. And so he used this very flimsy interpretation of the patent. And with Siemens' help, puts Berliner basically out of business with an injunction. And then Columbia says, Zonophone, you're fine. And Columbia initially sells Zonophone records until they get pissed off. And then they send seamen flying, and then they come up with their own records, the Climax, which were totally illegal because they didn't have any patent. And Frank Seaman's gone. The Columbia disc is there, which is Climax. Berliner's gone, and Eldridge Johnson comes out. All of this happens because of Philip Morrow. He totally disrupts the entire industry and changes it completely from how it was known. But your turn. You talk.
I actually found a Climax disc at a little antique shop in the middle of nowhere, California, and I remember feeling the material of the record, and I said, "This is oddly similar to Berliner, and this is oddly similar to Zonophone. The way they, the material they made their discs out of. It's a very thick kind of thing, and I know Berliners. They're smaller in diameter, but the material that they're made out of is very different than modern shellac as we know today.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
That was developed in Newark, New Jersey. The formula for the 78 record was developed by a company called Doranoid.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Doranoid created that mixture for Berliner's discs, also was publishing a bunch of them. And eventually on Victor records, you'll see it a lot. You'll see a D on the dead wax of early Victors, and that stands for Doranoid. All of the Nova records, the Patty records, the Tamanio records, almost all of those will have the Doranoid D. They're very, very important in the development of the 78 record. It's really kind of an important.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I just found and they stopped doing that around when the dog came on the logo, right? When did they stop doing that?
You mean the Doranoid?
Yeah, when did they stop pressing the D?
Well, actually, the D doesn't start coming out until about 1903.
That's right. Okay, so
it's past the pre-dog.
Right.
Because what happens is there's a massive fire in Victor, in Camden, and their pressing plant is really messed up, and so they take over the pressing for Victor and other small companies as well, and they will continue to press records for Victor well into about 1907, 1908, and all of the American Zonophones are pressed by Doranoid. I mean, they were an amazing company, and that was all in Newark, New Jersey, and eventually Victor purchased the whole company and moved it all to Camden.
Can you go into a little bit of what the material is made out of? Because it's really distinct. Do you know off the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, I cannot say, but I remember occasionally it had rope and horsehair and all kinds of stuff. It of course it's shellac. It has lampblack, hard rubber, and a number of other ingredients in smaller and smaller amounts. The whole idea, the reason for this development was because Berliner initially was using hard rubber. And the problem with that was it would flatten out in areas. And this shellac is not as smooth as the hard rubber, but it was very, very good at withstanding the hideous needles that they were using in those days.
Yes, actually,
a 3-penny nail,
Right. When I used to work for Tim Fabrizio, I still do work for Tim Fabrizio, but when he's down in Florida, I don't see him very much. But he has a Berliner gramophone that says "change the needle after 2 plays," and in the original Berliner instructions, if you don't have a needle, grab a nail and put it in.
A 3-penny nail. That was what that's what they suggested. And I'm just saying, no wonder so many of the Berliner records are as hideously beat up as they are, because not only are they using these needles that no one understood, really, hey, it still looks good, and plus the weight of the way with holding that horn and everything else there. It was a very, very destructive lathe in a sense on those records. And to see how many survive that are playable is pretty amazing as far as I'm concerned. But I think it's very important is that whole development at Doranoid. And Doranoid gets very little credit. No one talks about it. Nobody really knows about Doranoid. And people think that there was a misquote by one of the recording engineers years ago for Victor, who said that the D was for the Denison recording machine. And the thing is that made no sense whatsoever, because they started using that machine around 1906, 1907. And the recordings made at the Sistine Chapel have a D on them, which makes no sense whatsoever. Or Caruso's recordings, or Melba's. They were all made before that time. And also all the zonophones are marked that way. They wouldn't have used the fancy new recording machine on the cheap zonophones. It's the D for Doranoid.
That's right. That's right. Now, as we just passed the 20-minute mark, this was a really, really informative episode, Jack. Thank you for talking. And I'm really glad you got to share. I learned a lot just from this. And
I learned from you. I listen to you and I learn. We learn from each other. That's the
we're
important.
always sharpening each other.
Of course, we get a little sandpaper and sharpen our needles.
That's right. So,
but I look forward to doing some more.
Yes, me too. I can't wait. So you have another podcast to do a little bit later, and
thing on political history on another podcast.
Very good.
Bounced around bad penny here.
Very good. So that's going to do it for this one. Thank you everybody for watching. Please make sure, if you really like this, make sure to share it and like it. We can get a lot of attention from this, and hopefully some more younger people can learn a little bit from this too.
And one last thing, if you have an idea of what you'd like us to talk about, leave us a message. There's so many different areas to talk about with early recording. And I think to satisfy people's interest, let us know. We'd really appreciate it.
Please. And then I will also put I'll also give a little reminder of that in the description of the YouTube video to please suggest ideas, because me and Jack can just talk and talk and talk. But if you need something, if you would like something a little bit more, explained in a little more detail, or you want us to discuss something that's been of interest to you, please let us know. We will talk about it. We'd love to talk about it. And if you have any suggestions of any guests you'd like to see, please let us know. We'd be more than happy to have them on.
Yeah, that would be fun. It's a good thing we're not politicians. We'd never stop.
That's right. Very good. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you, everybody, for watching. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.